participative, right? Well, the first time at least, without getting it wrong. For those of you that have joined us before, you know that Pennie Taylor will host the session on behalf of GCVS, and thank you to Pennie for doing that. And we're also delighted today to welcome Tressa Burke, who will respond after Oliver has finished around perspectives from the local third sector. Thanks very much again to all of those for taking part. I'm just going to hand over to Pennie to get us started.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, before we get over to the main act for this hour, if I could just run through a little bit of housekeeping. We're really encouraging participants in this session to contribute your questions. You do that if you run your cursor down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see some icons. There's a Q&A icon. Click on that, it opens a box. You can ask a question. You can ask a question anonymously if you wish. And also, if a question has already been asked that you would like to ask, please click the like beside it, and that pushes it up a list. If you want to share any information, any links, please use the chat function, and there you can see that's the way the participants will chat to one another. And actually, Oliver Escobar has suggested that I might ask participants where you are right at this moment. If you wanted to kind of contribute that in the chat function, please do so at any point. But we're really looking forward to hearing from you when we get to that. Just to remind you that we're recording this session, so it will be live. And our next speaker, number 4 in this fantastic Our World Reimagined series, is Oliver Escobar, who's senior lecturer in public policy at the University of Edinburgh. And although he is a doctor, he doesn't like being referred to that way, which we might get into later. Oliver Escobar, before we hear your presentation, just bring us up to, you know, what got you involved personally in working in this field and in Scotland right now?
Yeah, thanks, Pennie, and hello everyone. It's really nice to see you know, so many places all over Scotland and beyond. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to do this. I suppose, I mean, I could go back a very long time, but it has a lot to do with Spanish history. It has a lot to do with the fact that we had a civil war, we had a dictatorship for 40 years, and democracy became a really hard-fought and hard-won achievement. And for people like myself, coming from a family where we had both sides of the Civil War represented, I was always amazed by how they managed to find a way to build a democracy despite those 40 years of dictatorship. And it also, so for me, democracy is not something I've learned from theory books. It's stuff that has to do with myself, someone who is the son of parents who never had a chance to get in school education, and I was the first one who had that chance, my generation, and that was thanks to democracy. So democracy is a very real thing to me. And then eventually I was very disappointed with the standard politics, standard democratic processes. So I got interested in participative democracy and democratic innovations.
Thank you, and thank goodness for us. You're bringing all that experience to the University of Edinburgh. And just to remind participants, thank you very much for telling us where you are. A lot of people are in cupboards, in homes across Scotland by the looks of it, but we have Dublin, Ireland, Dunoon, Argyll, Gorbals, Glasgow, and I think we'll be being joined by people from all over the world as well. So to tell us about democratic innovations and inspire your questions, please welcome Oliver Escobar.
Thanks, Pennie. Yeah, so I'm going to take 5 minutes just to kind of outline my take on this, and then I'll be very keen to just take it in the direction that participants here want to take it, and we can get into the detail of things depending on your own perspective and your own priorities. To me, so let's start just unpacking that term, participative democracy or participatory democracy. I never know which one is the correct one. And then I'll go from that to democratic innovation, establish the connection. I mean, a participative democracy is a democracy that tries to live up to its name and enable citizens to play a role in democratic life beyond just voting every few years, or protesting, or complaining, or just being consultees in the traditional formal sense. You know, electoral democracy, representative democracy, as we know it, was designed at a very particular time. It's particularly influenced by the circumstances of the years after the Second World War. And we needed expediency, and we needed to come to grips with how to govern in a complex context without having the infrastructures that we now have in communications and so on. So we developed a democracy that was very thin and that expected very little from citizens. Now, a participative democracy is a democracy where, you know, a citizen might be taking an active role in the economy, as we saw with the community wealth building event the other day, or take an active role through volunteering, or take an active role in taking part in governance and or developing local solutions to things, or national solutions to things, all of those kind of things. But the thing that I'm particularly interested in, because I think Scotland has a very vibrant third sector and a very vibrant civil society. But the thing that I'm particularly keen on is how do we connect all the important work that already happens in communities and turn it into effective decision making. And to me, that's when we arrive to our focus on institutions. We need to focus on reimagining and redesigning our institutions. And this is what democratic innovations try to do. And I can give some examples. But just if I could, before I do that, I'll just want to make a broader point as well, just to put these things in context. We are just now undergoing a democratic recession on a global scale. We have indicators that show that in the last 10 years, we have lost more democratic systems than in the previous 50. We now are in a situation where the democracy index shows that although almost half of the world's population live in some kind of democracy, only 5% of the entire world population, 5% lives in what we would consider a full democracy. Sadly, countries like the United States are no longer considered a full democracy. In the democracy index, it has fallen down and is considered a flawed democracy now, for a number of issues that we might or might not want to entertain. There is more indicators that talk about this democratic recession. In the UK, for example, the latest study of public satisfaction with democracy shows the highest level of dissatisfaction in the history of the UK. This came out just in January. Then we have the Global Attitude Survey that shows that there are authoritarian attitudes rising across the world, especially amongst the youngest populations in the world. Now, that to me is the canary in the mine, so to speak. Then we have on top of it what we now call in research what we call the participation gap. And this is the gap between the politically rich and the politically poor. Those who know how to play the game of politics and influence decision making, and those who are just nowhere near those spaces or those processes. And in the end, the democratic recession boils down to a very simple idea. People love the idea of democracy, but are very, very angry and dissatisfied at how it is practiced. So this is where democratic innovations come in. And this is by no means an easy space where everything is easy and straightforward. These are experiments. Many of them are, beautiful failures. Some of them are problematic successes. So it's a messy space. But democratic innovations are processes or institutions that are designed to reimagine the role that citizens have in decision making. And examples that we know well in Scotland are participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, some kind of collaborative governance arrangements that sometimes take place at community level, community anchor organizations when they play a role as well in that space, and very promisingly, online crowdsourcing, digital crowdsourcing. And this is the one example I suppose I want to highlight because it speaks to the moment we live in Scotland just now. One of the countries that has done the best in terms of trying to address the pandemic crisis has been Taiwan. And this has been thanks to the digital infrastructure that Taiwan had developed. Taiwan is a country where some of the hacktivists, these are activists who were in the sunflower movement, and they were tech entrepreneurs and so on, they now run the Ministry of Digital Participation. So what they've done is they are building infrastructure so that millions of people can engage in meaningful online dialogue, find consensus and compromise, and develop solutions. And now this is beginning to be credited with their ability to tackle the pandemic and the way they have managed to do, keeping cases at a very low level. So to me, the digital frontier of democratic innovation is particularly promising because we could get our countries from the local level to the transnational level, developing a more ambitious way of doing democracy, solving problems, and living up to the aspirations and expectations of citizens who want to see, a number of values driving decisions, and of course equality and fairness, but also solving the real issues that a lot of people are facing. So to me, to boil it down to a conclusion here, democratic innovations have the potential to help us reimagine what kind of institutions might be able to cope with what's coming down the line in the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that's from the climate emergency to the biotechnology revolution that is likely to increment inequalities, particularly health inequalities, on a level that we haven't seen so far. If we think things are bad now, wait for the rise of superhumans, which is coming. And all those things require governance. And all that governance, politicians cannot do it on their own. Experts cannot do it on their own. We need citizens at the heart of the new institutions that can cope, and not just cope, but thrive in governing the future in a meaningful way. I'm going to stop there, I think, and open it up so we can unpack some of those things.
Thank you so much. An awful lot of challenge in there, and some scary imagery, authoritarian tendency rising, and how can we counter that if, I suppose, that's what we decide to do. Oliver Escobar, you talked there about the potential for participatory democracy to change things, but are we up against such huge vested interest, big business, power bases that we have, that really there is any hope of being able to get the citizen voice through?
Yeah, I'm an optimist on this because I've seen change in my lifetime. And I imagine many of the people here will have seen change in their lifetime. In my case, much more obvious, because obviously the transition from a dictatorship to a democracy in a country is obviously as transformational as it can get. But I do take your point on the issue of power inequalities. And this is the point I was trying to make about the gap between the politically rich and the politically poor. The politically rich tend to be very well funded and be really good at lobbying. This is why what we need is institutions that actually help to flatten those political inequalities. There are ways of doing this. One of the reasons citizens' assemblies are becoming so popular is because they are less susceptible to lobbying pressures. These are people who come in to do a job over a period of time, try to look at the evidence, try to hear a range of perspectives, and then produce recommendations. And they are a less easy target for lobbyists and corporate powers. So I do have hope, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. I think these things need to all go hand in hand. Yes, we need new institutions, democratic innovations that bring about a more participative democracy, but we also need to democratize the economy, which is an argument that was made powerfully when talking about community wealth building. And these things go hand in hand.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk and chat about that not least in this series as it goes on, indeed. Let me ask you one of the questions that's been submitted by a delegate. Gordon B. would like to know whether any Scottish participatory budgeting experiments have been more than just participatory grant making for small third sector groups, i.e., have any such experiments allowed the public to really shape local government policy and spending for it to be more than lip service?
So is this, sorry, I missed the first bit. Is that a participatory budgeting?
About participatory budgeting.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
That the question's hooked on that, but I think it's reflecting some of the perhaps not suspicion as such, but, discomfort that, is this more than box ticking?
Yeah, we should always remain critical in the face of this agenda, and we should remain critical of democratic innovations. We should also remain critical of anyone who thinks that a particular model is the solution to all these problems. What we need is a richer ecology of democratic practices from communities to institutions. So let me put that first out front. And we should remain critical, but I think we need to be careful not to become cynical, because cynicism paralyzes us from changing. And so, we need to remain critical so that we don't take the status quo at face value. We need to avoid becoming cynical and stopping ourselves from effective change. Now, participatory budgeting is a really good example. Over the next few years, participatory budgeting in Scotland is expected to become mainstream and to take on bigger budgets. I'm still hoping to see that happening, but participatory budgeting is not just one thing. There are at least 12 or 14 models that have been mapped, and it's very different how it was conducted in Brazil in the 90s, how it is currently conducted in the city of Paris, or the model that we see in South Korea. These are all very different models that do very different things. The model in Scotland is being shaped as we speak. There is always the risk that it goes in the wrong direction. If it goes in the right direction, it could be one of the most transformative spaces for local governance in Scotland.
Oh, okay, now you talked about institutions, democratic institutions, reimagining institutions. Apply that in a Scottish context even, and illustrate us what that might mean.
Yeah, so imagine, for example, Glasgow City Council, just to kind of think locally, right? Just in light of our hosts here as well in the Glasgow Council for the voluntary sector. Well, maybe at some point, Glasgow City Council should think about creating a second chamber that is not populated by politicians, but populated by citizens, selected by lottery, for example.
The House of Lords.
Well, or substituting the House of Lords with the same system. I mean, some experiments in this direction are happening, for instance, in Ostbelgien, in the German-speaking region of Belgium, where, there is some interesting experimentation with a permanent chamber that rotates. And then you get the best of representation, which still has its virtues, and you get the best of sortition, random selection, lottery. And that could be a powerful combination. Combining those practices.
So effectively, what people would be called to it like jury duty. You'd be able to play your part whether you wanted to or not.
Yeah, and you rotate all the time. Not all the time, but you leave a little bit of space so that people can grow into the role, but then you rotate just before people become too powerful. And that's how you construct a chamber that looks more like the society it seeks to represent in demographic terms and in terms of perspective. I'm not saying this is a solution in every context, but that's an example of how you can disrupt the existing institutional landscape by redesigning and bringing in other forms of thinking and doing democracy.
Are any of our public bodies anywhere near doing something like that in Scotland that you know of?
Not as a permanent feature, but Scotland just now is doing a few citizens' assemblies. There is one on the future of Scotland. There is one on the climate emergency. So we are going to learn a lot from that. What we don't have yet is the ambition to say, look, we're not just building new community engagement processes. What we are building here are institutions for the future. Those might not look like these experiments we're doing now, but these experiments are a stepping stone towards that. And we really need to do that because there is a democratic recession, and what's at stake is actually, what's going to happen, how we're going to cope with what's coming down the line in the next few years.
And certainly in a Scottish context. Francesca Spagnoletti asks, how is democracy in Scotland? You talked about the democracy index, which is fascinating. How do we make sure that people hardest hit in the current crisis have a real say in shaping the future? So really two questions in there for me. One, does Scotland feature at all in the democratic index as a standalone entity, or are we sitting within the UK?
As the UK.
Yeah, okay. And secondly, how do we make sure, because this is another form of democracy really, that we don't leave the poorest behind as we go forward from here on in?
Yeah. And that's the whole point. I mean, the one thing that democratic innovations have going for them is that there is a stronger emphasis on equalities, representation, and tackling those power differences across social groups than what we see in standard institutions. So that's, but Scotland is quite peculiar because Scotland has a very centralized system of governance. We don't have local. Some people will have heard me say this before. I say it as a provocation, but there's a lot of truth to it. We do not have local government in Scotland, not by European standards anyway. We're like, in some cases, 10 times larger, our local authorities than the average in mainland Europe. So, local governance reform would be a good starting point. Might not be the sexiest topic, but it's got to start somewhere. But the point as well, about the sort of the UK place in the democracy index. At the moment, the UK is still considered a full democracy. It's still in the top 20, 21. Now, there are some questions about how the index is constructed, of course. And it's worth saying as well that the index is built on standard measures of representative democracy. It doesn't really include stuff around participative and deliberative democracy. But the issue of exclusion, and this is the point I was trying to make earlier about political inequalities. Why should we care about political inequalities, about people who really have very little influence over the decisions and the services that run their life? And the reason we should care is because, to me, and I'll put my bias is as a political scientist, I see power everywhere, right? So that's my bias, I accept it. But to me, every single inequality that you can think of is a product of power inequalities. So to me, inequalities in health, wealth, income, education, they all have the same root cause, and those are power inequalities.
It very deeply, and leading even to shortening lifespans. It's reached that situation in Scotland, hasn't it? But going backwards. Here, Martina Johnson-Gray asks about the digital divide. She says, currently trying to work on the digital divide. As we know, many vulnerable citizens aren't digitally included. Could this lead to those people's voices not being heard again? And actually that ties up with a comment that's come in by another means, basically saying, do, for instance, even the citizens' assemblies exclude certain groups, not necessarily because of digital exclusion, but for other reasons? How do we get to what used to be called in a very offensive way, the hard to reach, and otherwise known as the not tried hard enough to reach?
Yeah, great questions. I'm just making a note so that I don't forget the second one. Some colleagues, Peter Matthews and others, say, well, it's not hard to reach, it's easy to ignore. And we even published a review of equalities in community engagement some time ago in What Works in Scotland with that title. Now, the digital divide, well, this is so important, isn't it? Because the one thing we've realized is that a lot of life now happens online. This is not just in pandemic times, right? I mean, a lot of life just happens there. I mean, the way people access welfare support, the way people access services, the way people interact. with their community, but also with institutions. Now, if life is happening online, surely digital infrastructure should now be considered a human right. And I think we have a lot to do to work in that direction. We know that there are countries where this is a reality. I mean, Iceland is virtually 100% online. Estonia has been built digitally from the ground up. This is doable, and it's doable here as well. It just requires building infrastructure with the same passion and energy that people put into building all those roads those years ago. Well, this is just, if not more important than that was. So that's one thing. The other thing about how things like citizens' assemblies exclude people, just quickly. This is true. You know, they are exclusive in the sense that you cannot put yourself forward. I cannot put myself forward. I might put forward an argument that goes there or submit evidence, but people are selected by lottery so that we overcome the self-selection bias that tends to mean that those who are politically rich occupy consultation spaces, forums. So lottery gets over that. That's what it tries to do. But I always say that these spaces, assemblies, juries, they cannot be seen in isolation or built in isolation. We still need the good old-fashioned community organizing. We still need all the other repertoire of things happening. But we are in a society where we are all really busy. You cannot expect people to be involved in everything all the time. So every once in a while, we will want to do that division of labor where we say, we're going to empower this assembly to do a lot of work on our behalf with channels fitting into it and with other things built around it so that it's not an island. But we do need a division of labor, and lottery is one of the ways of doing that.
Now, what's really interesting about that is, and I've watched the Citizens Assembly online output, and it's marvelous stuff. These are important discussions. But what happens to that information? The one I watched was basically summarising what kind of Scotland do we want to see, and you couldn't argue with any of it. But where does it go? Yeah,
that's such a good point. And this is, you know, I mean, I think here I need to be a little bit careful because on the Citizens Assembly of Scotland, I sit on the research team and we are keeping an open mind. We're looking at the evidence we are gathering. It's still not finished. And, you know, so it's early to say, but I think it's uncontroversial that if you don't give an assembly a specific job and to consider trade-offs and to do something that then can be usable, then it can be a struggle. I'm not saying that's what's happening there, but we'll see. But the most important thing is the point that these assemblies shouldn't be an island. They need to be coherently connected into communities and into institutions. And there needs to be clarity on how is it that then public institutions, public services, agencies are going to enact some of the work that comes through that. It cannot be just whatever the assembly says goes ahead, because we need checks and balances. That's where parliament comes in. That's where other spaces for participation come in. But it's again about that division of labor, and impact is always to be tempered, right? These assemblies need to be given meaningful jobs where they can really help us to move forward on an issue. The one that starts in November on climate, on the climate emergency, is given a very big job in trying to move us forward and to see what has been blocking action on climate and how can we get to a more ambitious transformative agenda. But unless there is a clear commitment by the hosting institutions, in the case of that one is the Scottish Parliament, and there is that commitment, the Parliament itself called for it and is resourcing it, unless there is that commitment, there is a risk of a lack of impact. But we cannot put all the eggs on the basket of these assemblies. Let's be clear about that. They can do an important job, but there is many other players, and that's where the broader picture of a participative democracy comes in.
Thank you, and that leads me very nicely onto another question. Francesca Spagnoletti asks, one of the things that the third sector tells us is that there's a national-local disconnect. Communities struggle to be heard in shaping national policy and budgets. Can we change it? Can we change this? And I'm going to add the word how. How can we change this? How can we bridge that gulf?
Yeah, and now this is when I get into the territory where I start saying unpopular things, or maybe not. Let's see what you all think. So you see, take for example a country like Spain. In the Spanish Constitution, the local and the national government are both written into the constitution, so they are equals. In Scotland, there is a kind of an implicit hierarchy, where sometimes local government is seen as a delivery arm of the national level institutions. Local government in Scotland has very little power. I know people often disagree with this. There is no comparison whatsoever. I challenge anyone in the chat to find another country where local government has so little power as it has in Scotland. And this comes from a lack of fiscal ability to manage its own finances and taxes. It comes from a number of competencies that are just not there at the local level. And it comes from having mega local authorities. Just as an example, Scotland has 32 local authorities for 5 million people. Galicia, which is the part of Spain where I come from, has 300 councils for 2.5 million people. Now, I'm not saying that that's the solution. I'm just pointing that there is a gap between local communities and institutions. In Scotland, we've tried to fill that gap with community planning partnerships, with health and social care integration partnerships. This is a governance gap between communities of place and institutions. But is not quite working. So I think local governance is part of the thing that needs to be reformed to get somewhere.
And that's a pretty big reform. Let me ask a question put by Jane Cullingworth. What role can intermediary bodies like third sector interfaces play in facilitating democratic involvement and innovation across the third sector? Because one way of helping to fill that vacuum you described is for the third sector stepping in and harnessing its representative power there. Or does it not work that way? Is representative power just another kind of power?
So this is interesting. I almost feel wrong to speak to Jane about this, because Jane is the expert on that very issue. So she might have something else to say in the chat. And I recommend everyone to check Jane Cullingworth's thesis on this very issue. But I'll give my 2 cents on this. Now, third sector interfaces, and I've worked with a bunch of them across the country occasionally, I've done things with them. I think they have a lot of potential to create that space for representation. Some of them are already doing it. I mean, the third sector in Scotland, civil society at large in Scotland is like nothing I've seen in the countries I'm familiar with, nor in Spain, nor in France, nor in Poland, and other countries that might be a more vibrant civil society, not the ones I'm familiar with. So I've been always amazed with the capacity, the energy, but there has always been a risk as well of the third sector being very close to the state as partners in the delivery of things. And that sometimes diminishes the role that the third sector also needs to play as an advocate and a challenger of existing powers. And I think that that's an equilibrium that maybe has gone a little bit too much on the side of making the third sector too dependent on public money. And this is again where the community wealth building agenda comes back into the picture. Just one other point about third sector interfaces. This is another really good example of the centralizing force that runs a lot of the sort of Scottish national government mindset. You know, the Scottish government, some parts of the Scottish government over the years have they see the world, so there are 32 councils, so we shall have 32 third sector interfaces. Well, that's not how communities in Scotland organize themselves. And in some places, the TSI, the third sector interface, has been a problematic space where, you know, there's a legacy of acrimony and so on. So that has a lot to do with these things being organized top down rather than bottom up. But I have, you know, a lot of faith in the capacity that is there, and a lot of concern about what's coming down the line in terms of financial pressures, because, you know, there are bailouts for everyone, but a lot of the people who should be really getting the bailouts.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that picks up another point I'd like to come back to that was raised in another talk. But let me go to Claire Lyle, who has asked, what do you think about the challenge voluntary organisations have in a climate of cuts? You know, the pandemic just now. I know that in Glasgow, for example, a number of organisations face this at present. The organisation I work with involves members having a say and a seat at the table with council and Scottish Government officers. Do you feel this is tokenistic, or do you believe that it really does influence future policy and delivery, especially when budget cuts and constraints are substantial?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And we've been, you know, with some colleagues who are in the session today and others who will be watching will know that we've been having this conversation for a long time. There is always a dilemma for a third sector organization, for a voluntary group, for a community group. There's always a dilemma when a partnership comes up. Do I take part, collaborate, try to make something happen? And sometimes that works. Or do I stay out and apply pressure from the outside? And the thing is, this is highly context dependent, because in some places, partnerships can work really well and become very effective. But in some places, sometimes I just wish that the third sector exercise the power it has by saying, look, we've spent 3 years trying to make something happen on this important issue. It's not happening. We're going to come out of this space and we are going to enter into campaigning mode and apply pressure from the outside. And there is research that does show that, and this might sound like a paradox, but it does show that sometimes collaboration requires contestation. In other words, sometimes for a collaborative space to work, it has to have pressures from the outside that gives it the incentive to work. And that pressure sometimes needs to be applied by the third sector. And sometimes that might require coming out of partnerships. And I should say as well that for many years I've worked with community planning partnerships and done a lot of research on them. Some of them work really well, some of them not so well. We know that. So this is to say, you know, it's been since 1995, the first pilots on community planning. So some people might want to ask themselves, are we where we want to be in these spaces? Or is it time to change the strategy? Because the time that third sector organizations have is precious, and you need to choose where do you put that time? How do you spend that time? We don't have the luxury, they don't have the luxury that sometimes is in some parts of the public sector in terms of being able to attend endless meetings and so on.
This ties up with something that I've been hearing. I think Cormac Russell talked about that, you know, instead of money going to the people that need it, it goes to the people that work with the people that need it. Do you think there's a danger that this becomes a little industry of its own? It's you know, we know it's a difficult nut to crack. Governments all over the world would love the secret, the clue to cracking it. It's a difficult box.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and you know, there is a well-documented, I mean, just to come back a little bit and connect this to the point I was making earlier about the field of democratic innovation and how it is expanding and how many democratic innovators are out there, new organizations, as well as some of the ones that are well established. And there is a professionalization of that field on a level that we have seen before in other parts of the third sector. Now, with professionalization come a number of risks, of course. On the one hand, you know, it can help to develop expertise, to consolidate knowledge, to create a space that has some stability to work forward. On the other hand, it also brings incentives like, you know, chasing grants, being too dependent on certain, on the bottom line, things like that, which are understandable for the survival of especially small organizations. But you know, in Europe, I'm talking here now at a broader level, I haven't seen some of the developments that we have seen in North America, where the field of democratic innovation is increasingly populated by for-profit organizations. I think we are seeing less of that now, so far, at least in Europe as a continent, but it might be down the line, and we need to be aware of the risks. But I think this is also something that, and I know this is not always possible, and I'll be very keen to hear what Tressa is going to say about this, for example, because, you know, if we could create situations where third sector organizations could generate revenue that gives them independence, right? By being part of some of the community wealth building schemes that hopefully are going to be developing over the country, by taking over assets, by developing a community economy. We have a new paper on the community economy, which some people here might want to take a look at. If that could happen more often, that will give a level of independence that would allow the sector to, be professional, but in its own terms, rather than shaped as a mirror of, say, the civil service or existing systems elsewhere. I know this is not always possible, and I don't want to say that there, of course, we still need a lot of the organizations that just really need the grants and the support and so on, and cannot generate their own revenue. But in a community economy, there should be many more opportunities for social enterprise, cooperative, and so on, to become the way in which the third sector anchors a level of independence that allows it to keep that beautiful dance with the public sector in which we get things done because there is collaboration, but also contestation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And participants, keep your questions coming because we have got a few minutes left that we can use to answer any questions you might have. But here's one from Liz W, which is, how do you balance the need for effective decision-making with the importance of independence, this is with a lowercase I, and true democracy? For example, we have few independent politicians, and that's independent of any political party, I think would be fair to say. For example, we have few independent politicians, even at a local council level, so they align with their party even when they don't necessarily agree with something. No one speaks out if they think something's been undemocratic in decision-making, for example, for fear of going against the party. So do our very democratic structures need looking at, Oliver Escobar?
Oh, absolutely. I'm really glad that that question has come up because, you know, and this is the point I was trying to make. I don't think I'm ready. Maybe in you know, in later years when I might change my view, but I don't think I'm ready to let go of representative democracy and electoral democracy. But I'm definitely ready not to make it the centerpiece of democracy. It's got to be just one component. There's much more than this too. And politicians need help, and they don't know how to ask for it, because the media doesn't allow them, because we don't allow them. You know, imagine if a politician comes out and says, hey, this is such a complex issue. This is so difficult. We really need to mobilize collective intelligence and deliberation to deal with it. What's going to happen? Immediately you can hear the journalists or the hecklers saying, oh, so you have no clue, so you have no leadership, so you don't know what to do. And we just need to change our mindset. We need to allow politicians to ask for help, and we need to be ready to give that help. Being a politician is extremely difficult. I mean, I've been all my life, because of the family I come from and because of the situation we had there, I've always been asked whether I will be tempted to go there. And I'm thinking, wow, I mean, I think being a politician is one of the hardest jobs ever. You know, local councillors in Scotland have no time whatsoever. They are really badly paid, almost as, you know, the worst paid in Europe. I don't have the figures in front of me, but I don't think it's a big stretch. They are not well paid. They have no time whatsoever to get through tons of evidence and to relate to their constituents. They have constituencies that are so massive that even if they tried every day of the year to meet their communities, they wouldn't be able to meet every citizen, as compared to, say, Finland, where a councillor represents on average around 100 people, and you can meet them, right, over time. Now, councillors have an impossible job, but they don't feel that they can ask for help because there's no public sympathy. The same applies for members of parliament. There is a beautiful book by the journalist Isabel Hardman, and the book is titled, Why Do We Get the Politicians That We Get? And she makes a very compelling case and paints a very compelling picture of why politicians cannot do their job as legislators. And I encourage everyone to take a look, and you will have a little bit more sympathy. The point of having more independent politicians is crucial, but it's a chicken and egg situation. Being a politician is criticized and despised, and therefore people don't go into it. And because people don't go into it, politicians don't look a lot like us. So we need to break that cycle, but also we need to be mindful of where we are just now. And in Scotland, local councillors, despite whatever they might tell you and how it looks like, they really don't have that much power, certainly not compared to European standards. And just the point on effectiveness that was asked, so because this is a key question on participative democracy and democratic innovation. Sometimes we need expedient decisions, sometimes we need to, that is true, but now I can give you lots of cases where standard ways of making decisions took far longer than a participatory process could. And you know, we have local cases. Some people here will be familiar with the Portobello High School case in Edinburgh that took forever, and it was partly because it was done top down. But there are the case I mentioned earlier in Taiwan, you know, in terms of expediency in creating a space to find ways of addressing the pandemic in real time. So it's not a given that these things are slower or less effective if the right infrastructure is there.
Thank you. And I think that this ties up very neatly with Susie Haywood's question here. For those of us active in communities, what can we actually do to build political participation among communities when there's a history of people being ignored or let down in the past? How can we work with people who are currently shut out when it comes to participation, when we maybe aren't confident that our institutions really don't welcome their involvement? Tired of making promises, says Susie, getting hopes up, and then people are let down. I mean, that's a huge challenge to ask somebody to take on.
Yeah, and that's what happens when, and this is going to keep happening unless we really change. This is what happens when you create an electoral democracy where the incentive is to promise ever more. It's a consumerist model. I'm going to be the one who gives you a bigger shopping list. I'm the one who's going to promise you the most. Now, you cannot blame political parties for doing that because, in a sense, when they don't do it, when they try to be more realistic, they get a lot of stick as well. So this is a two-way relationship. This is not just about political parties. As citizens, we need to create this space where they don't need to overpromise. And part of that is creating opportunities by involving citizens in everyday governance in all sorts of spaces so that people can develop an appreciation of the trade-offs, the trade-offs of making decisions, the choices, the hard choices that need to be made, and so on. The problem is that for a very long time, we've treated citizens, we've infantilized citizens by doing community engagement that says, here's a blank canvas, what do you want? Well, that's not how decisions work, right? It's more productive when you create a process where people get a chance to consider the issues, look at evidence, hear perspectives from other people, and then make decisions. So we need to get to that level of maturity. And for me, it all boils down to this, is the question, what kind of citizen are we inviting citizens to be? Spectators, protesters, complainers, or problem solvers, co-producers, deliberators. And this is what institutions need to do. They need to ask themselves, what kind of citizen are we inviting citizens to be? And whatever invitation you extend, that's what you're going to get. If you create a system for complaints, you will get complainers. If you create a system for co-production, you will get co-producers.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So involve people positively in something rather than asking people to respond necessarily. And I think this leads us into, which is possibly our last question, but an anonymous attendee is asking, do you think the vibrant civil society in Scotland, so if we accept we have a relatively vibrant civil society, do you think that's a result of the local national gap that we've been talking about? Or is there another reason?
I actually think that that's a big part of it. I think that that hits part of the nail on the head, because that vacuum has had to be filled with just mobilizing and self-organizing, and it also has to do, there has been support for the sector to develop over time, support by people, and now that should become even more common through crowdsourcing and stuff like that. But also, there have been times when there has been state support to anchor the field and so that's been important. But I think it has a lot to do, and this is not a bad thing. I don't say this is a critique. It has a lot to do with the fact that we don't have a local state. So a lot of, and that is something that I personally like, because, I have some sympathy for some of the sort of more anarchist style type of arguments. There is stuff there in history that is of use for anyone who cares about democracy, self-governing. I think we need that balance, civil society, state, and so on. But yeah, the third sector has grown considerably because it has had to plug in a lot of gaps that in other places will be filled by the state.
Well, here's a question that I think relates to that one. Gordon B, don't we need a grassroots movement that can create the solidarity that used to be fostered by, for instance, labor unions? Gordon B is saying, I see a lot of good ideas circulating in policy circles, but I don't see the motivated people power to make any of it happen when it clashes with the interests of self-serving institutional power. In a recent Our World Reimagined presentation, we heard about the need for renewed community development that started to be taken apart by Margaret Thatcher, I think. Is that what we need? You talked about potential anarchy here.
Well, I wouldn't take it as far, but I think there's a lot in that tradition that sometimes we underutilize in terms of a healthy balance between state and civil society, rather than putting all our eggs on the basket of the state yeah, the grassroots. Absolutely. I mean, unions, that would take another whole session. My dad used to be a trade unionist as a factory worker. I learned a lot. I grew up in that space. There's a lot in that space that I used to like. And there's a lot in that space that made me run away a mile because I didn't think it was democratic. I think the culture, at least then, in the 80s and the 90s, had all sorts of problems with sexism, homophobia, etc., etc. I'm not saying that that's but I'm just saying that there are spaces, traditional spaces, that are very problematic and have a very elitist view. And that includes some of the traditional, as the unions used to be in some places, like in Spain. That has changed over time, but the point I want to make is there is a strong case to say, unless communities have independence to then be able to affect change. Now, whether that happens through unions or new forms of organizing, I don't have a view on that. I think we need a variety, but that is necessary. But we also still need, at the other end, institutions that can work with that. And that's where digital crowdsourcing comes in. That's where mini publics, assemblies coming, and so on. So, you know, we need an ecology rather than just one thing.
And arguably, we have an opportunity to build that ecology now like never before, yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, there have been a couple of questions raised that I think we need to pick up in some of the notes there. You mentioned a community economy paper, Oliver. It would be great that we can put that. I'll give people more information about how we can access that later. But I'd very much like to introduce now, to give a response to what she's heard from you. Can we say hi, please, to Tressa Burke, Chief Executive of Glasgow Disability Alliance. Hi, Tressa.
Hi, Penny. Thanks so much. Thanks also, Oliver. I really, really enjoyed your input there. So much of what you said resonates with my own views and reflections, and also the experiences of disabled people. And I know there's been a lot of conversation and comments and questions about how unequal people can play a part in democracy. And I think that disabled people really are the epitome of that. And I've got quite a lot to say about that, but I'll try and keep my comments really brief. So I welcomed a lot of what you had to say, because disabled people have always fared worse in relation to outcomes and inequalities. They're amongst the worst hit by austerity. They're more likely to be unemployed and in secure employment, economically inactive, as well as being less likely to have formal qualifications. They have health inequalities and poorer life outcomes all round. And in actual fact, the Office of National Statistics tells us that not only is their life expectancy shorter, but they are much more likely to have higher levels of suicide as well. Loneliness and isolation compound this all, creating a sense of despair and hopelessness. And the UN had already declared disabled people's lives a human catastrophe, and that was before COVID. Now, before COVID, BC, it's taken on a new meaning, I think, in these times, because if disabled people had experienced inequalities before, then these have absolutely been supercharged in recent times. And we've been working alongside disabled people for 20 years, and over the last 6 months, really intensively engaged. And there's a couple of headlines that I think are really, really important to share with you. So we've spoken to thousands of people. We've more than doubled our staff, repurposing monies that we had to involve disabled people. And we've spoken to over 5,000 people through 8,500 calls, and sent out letters and sent out emails and all sorts of things. And we've got a report all on this on our website, just in case people are interested, not only in what disabled people's experiences are, but what GDA has done to support that as well. But what they told us was that they were struggling to access supports, 80% not aware of things they could access in their local communities. And in 2018, through our action research report on participatory budgeting, we found that 71% had difficulty taking part in things in their local community. So obviously that's increased, which isn't really a surprise. 41% struggling to find accessible information. Something that's come up today, 60% of people not having access to digital connections. So that's either not having access to the IT, to the kit, or to the broadband, or the confidence to use it. And then there was 47% of these thousands and thousands of people worried about food and medication. 90% worried about their physical and mental health, and 82% worried about isolation. And there was huge issues around social care. So 47% of the thousands we spoke to were worried about social care, but actually over 2,000 packages were cut in Glasgow at the outset of lockdown. And there were good reasons why some of that happened. The workforce, a lot of them, the kind of nature of the working class, mainly women workforce, a lot of them were shielders or were looking after shielders. So there was good reasons for it, but it was still a very fragile system which collapsed and let disabled people slip between the gaps. Interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, in the middle of a global pandemic, 90% of disabled people said that they thought it was really important for their voices to be heard. And also they felt it was really important that disabled people's organisations played a role. And I think that is something that you've touched on, Oliver, in relation to some of that grassroots participative democracy, capacity building, peer support, things that build and energise and promote participation. In no way is that one, you know, the only solution, but it is definitely part of a suite and an ecology of things. And I think the thing about disabled people is that our organisations are accountable to and run by disabled people. So I'm a disabled person myself as the chief exec, I'm the founding chief exec and one of the founder members. The board are all disabled people. So that accountability of being with, of and for disabled people, I would rather never be in a room if I didn't have other disabled people in it with me, standing alongside me and basically speaking for themselves rather than me having to do it, because even although I'm a disabled person, I have a certain amount of privilege. So that's the kind of model that we have. And we're really committed to that. I've just come from a meeting with our social care experience forum, and during that people were talking about their experiences of getting their social care packages cut, of being able to not take medication, not being able to wash, dress. I mean, you're talking about people not being able to take part in the most basic decisions in their own life, never mind participative democracy about systems and institutions. And I think we need to have a recognition and an honest conversation about how far removed people are. It's not all bad news, right enough, because there definitely is hope. There is a reality check about how much support people need. I think that's really important, but people have been supported through processes. So, for example, over the last couple of years, GDA was involved in supporting disabled people through participatory democracy and through participatory budgeting in particular. And there was lots of brilliant outcomes. Picking up on some of the questions that come up earlier on, I don't think there was a transference of power in any of that. I think there was influence, but there was also wonderful outcomes around participation, sense of belonging to communities, sense of confidence, sense of people actually testing out the waters and having an appetite to do more and be more involved in those decisions and actually start to get more involved in influence and change. We've been doing this kind of work for 20 years, as I say, and there's some films on the website, Glasgow Disability Alliance's website. There's reports as well that talk about all of this work. I don't want to go on too long because I'm aware of time, but what I would say is that our model for involvement proves, disabled people-led organisations model for involvement proves that with access and support and connections, disabled people can be and do want to be involved, but it does take support. And I think that that's really important, that people can play a meaningful role. And in fact, if their voices aren't heard, it's a real missing part of the solutions that we need to a lot of the complex problems that we're dealing with, not just in our own communities, but in wider societies as well. Unfortunately, and to some extent understandably, although PB and participative endeavours do offer opportunities, I think it is worth saying that in all honesty, and probably very understandably, these processes have stalled due to COVID. And I am concerned, having been in this field for over 27 years, that this all might be kicked into the long grass, and right at a time when people have got so much to offer in coming up with the solutions and shaping the solutions and shaping policies and services and co-designing, that in actual fact that all might be kicked into the long grass. So what I would say is that we need urgently decisive and strong political leadership. We need actions, and we need it to be backed by funding, and we need that political leadership to be at a national government level and a local government level. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Tressa. Thank you so much. Oliver, we've got a couple of minutes left to us. In terms of the response to that, if there's a real desire to do this from a grassroots roots perspective, representing what I call real people, how can different parts of our civic society in Scotland join forces to make this happen?
Yeah, I think this is kind of happening. I mean, there are lots of really powerful connections and alliances and networks being built, and all of that is part of the picture. But I suppose I would like to make 2 points in response to Tressa, and thanks Tressa for that. Just super quick, yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah, just one is the reason why systems and institutions matter, and it's because unless we crack that, I'm afraid the stuff that you're calling for is not going to happen. I have very little hope that current leadership structures and political leadership will be able to crack those things. We need to reform the institutions. It's a chicken and egg thing. And we do need to embed, it's not just about having, democracy cannot be just about having the right to vote. It's also about having the right to have all the support that you need in order to live, so that then you can have a political life. And that only happens with systems change and institutional change. And the final thing I would say, in the space of, and I know that the work that the Disability Alliance does, and the 2 things we really need to keep an eye on, and I think that's where the real, one, biotechnology. That's the thing that is going to have the biggest impact in disabled communities that we have ever seen. And the other is algorithmic justice, something that sounds very jargony and is going to change everything, because decisions about the support that people get are going to be done by algorithms, and we need to govern that, which takes us back to having democratic institutions that can do that.
Thank you. That sounds like the subject of 2 more our Reimagined talks. Before I say thank you so much to our participants, let me remind participants that on Thursday, the 1st of October, 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, we're going to be hearing from Sarah Davidson, Chief Executive of the Carnegie UK Trust, on accelerating the shift to an enabling state. Thank you so much, Tressa Burke, and particularly Oliver Escobar, for yet another wonderful big idea. Share these ideas, #OWR big ideas. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Pennie. Thanks, everyone. Bye.